December 23, 1944, somewhere in the frozen hell of Belgium. General George S. Patton stood beside his jeep, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, watching something that should have been impossible. A Sherman tank, that reliable, but tragically slow workhorse of the American armored divisions, was pulling away from his convoy. Not just keeping pace, not struggling to maintain speed, actually accelerating ahead of his jeep like it had somewhere important to be. Patton's driver pushed the accelerator to the floor. The jeep's engine screamed in protest. The Sherman kept pulling away. The general's jaw tightened. He had commanded armor since North Africa. He knew every specification of every tank in the European theater. He had cursed the Sherman's limitations in a dozen languages, had written scathing letters to ordnance demanding better, faster, deadlier tanks. And here, on a muddy road outside Bastogne during the largest German offensive in years, one of those same Shermans was making his jeep look like it was standing still. Someone had painted a name on the turret in white letters: Detroit Speed Shop. Below it, stenciled in smaller text, Kowalski, Special Number 1. Patton grabbed the radio handset. His voice carried that particular edge that made colonels nervous and privates terrified. He wanted that tank stopped. He wanted the crew assembled, and he wanted to know what in the hell they had done to it. Because in Patton's army, there were no miracle tanks. There were regulations, specifications, and the cold, hard physics of steel and horsepower, yet somehow, impossibly. A motor pool mechanic from Detroit had just rewritten everything the general thought he knew about armored warfare. This is the story of Corporal Eddie Kowalski, the bus engine he stole, and how one unauthorized modification changed the course of the Battle of the Bulge. Eddie Kowalski had grease under his fingernails before he could write his own name. Born in 1922, Polish immigrants in Detroit's East Side. He grew up in a neighborhood where the big three automakers provided every paycheck and shaped every conversation. His father worked a line at Dodge. His uncle supervised maintenance at a Ford plant. Eddie found his calling with the Detroit Department of Transportation, keeping the city's bus fleet running through Michigan winters that could freeze diesel solid and summers that boiled radiators dry. By the time he turned 20, Eddie could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. A slight knock in the third cylinder. A timing chain, one link to loose. A fuel injector delivering 10% less than optimal flow. He heard what others missed, fixed what others declared unfixable, and had a reputation among drivers as the guy who could resurrect buses that other mechanics had written off as scrap. Then December 7th, 1941 happened. Pearl Harbor turned the world upside down. Eddie received his draft notice in March 1942. The Army looked at his civilian occupation, noted his technical expertise, and assigned him to the Ordnance Department. After basic training at Fort Knox, they shipped him to North Africa as part of the 3rd Armored Division's maintenance company. His job was simple in theory, impossible in practice: keep the tanks running. The M4 Sherman medium tank was the backbone of American armored forces, and Eddie learned to hate and love it in equal measure. The Sherman was reliable. It was mechanically sound. It was easy to repair compared to the temperamental German Panthers. It was also a death trap. The Sherman's 75mm gun struggled to penetrate German Tiger and Panther tanks frontally. Its armor was too thin, and most frustratingly for Eddie, it was underpowered. It's a Continental R975 radial aircraft engine that powered most Shermans produced. 400 horsepower. It's adequate for its 30-ton weight, but leaving no margin for the kind of performance that saved lives in combat. Crews had gallows humor about it. They called Shermans Ronsons after the cigarette lighter because they lit the first time every time. They called them Tommy Cookers because of how fast they burned when penetrated. Eddie worked on dozens. of them patched holes, replaced transmissions, pulled burned crews from hatches. And every time, he thought the same thing. These boys needed more than armor. They needed speed. Speed to flank. Speed to retreat. Speed to survive. By December 1944, Eddie's unit had fought through North Africa, Sicily, France, and into Belgium. They were positioned near Bastogne when the Germans launched their massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. On December 19th, during a German artillery barrage, Eddie took cover in what remained of a Belgian bus depot on the outskirts of a small town whose name he never learned. The depot had taken a direct hit days earlier. Buses lay scattered like children's toys, some burning, some already gutted. Eddie moved through the wreckage, professional instinct overriding fear, and that's when he saw it. A GMC 8-cylinder diesel. Engine, massive and intact, sitting in a bus that had somehow avoided the worst of the shelling. The engine block alone probably weighed 800 pounds. It was designed to haul double-decker buses loaded with passengers through city streets, up hills, through every kind of weather. Eddie stood there in the smoke and chaos, and a thought formed. A crazy, probably court-martial-worthy thought. What if that engine could haul something else? Eddie returned to the motor pool that night with two other mechanics he trusted, Corporal Jimmy Breslin from the Bronx and Private First Class Marcus Webb from Atlanta. He showed them the bus depot. He explained his idea. Jimmy thought he was insane. Marcus asked how much time they had before someone noticed a missing bus engine. Eddie's answer was simple. They would work at night. They had a Sherman waiting for repair anyway, tank number 275, which had thrown a track and cracked its engine block, hitting a crater at full speed 2 days earlier. The tank was already written off for major overhaul. Nobody would miss it. For a week, maybe 2. Nobody except Eddie was going to fix it anyway, given how desperate things were getting with the German offensive. They used a recovery vehicle to extract the bus engine just after midnight. The thing was a monster, far larger than the Continental radial it would replace, and the engineering challenges were immediately apparent. The mounting points were completely different. The bus engine sat longitudinal while the Sherman's radial was oriented differently. The transmission would need an adapter plate fabricated from scratch. The cooling system required total redesign. The fuel system needed conversion from diesel to gasoline because supply chain logistics made diesel impossible. Eddie sketched modifications on whatever paper he could find. He measured clearances with calipers by flashlight. He fabricated parts in the machine shop during his official duty hours, telling the motor pool sergeant he was making replacement components for standard repairs. At night, the real work happened. They pulled the wrecked Continental engine and started test fitting the bus engine. It was 2 wide by 4 inches. Eddie cut and re-welded the engine bay supports, a modification that would have horrified Army engineers. The driveshaft alignment was off by 15 degrees. Marcus fabricated a custom coupling that took 3 tries to get right. A cooling system was Eddie's masterpiece. He cannibalized radiators from 2 destroyed Shermans, plumbed them in series, and created a cooling capacity 40% greater than standard. He knew the bus engine would run hotter under combat conditions. The oil system required a custom pan because ground clearance was tighter in a tank than a bus. The electrical system needed complete rewiring. And through it all, they worked in near silence, speaking only when necessary, jumping at every sound that might be an officer making rounds. On the 6th night, Captain Morrison found them. The captain stood in the motor pool bay doorway, staring at the butchered Sherman with an expression somewhere between horror and fury. He demanded an explanation. Eddie, covered in grease, hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline, tried to explain the performance advantages. The captain cut him off. This was destruction of Army property. This was an unauthorized modification that violated a dozen regulations. This was potentially sabotage. Eddie was looking at court-martial, but the captain made a mistake. He said Eddie had 24 hours to restore the tank to standard configuration or face formal charges. He didn't post a guard. T didn't confiscate their tools. He just walked away, confident that his order would be followed. Eddie and his crew worked through that entire night and into the next day. They weren't restoring anything. They were finishing what they started. By dawn on December 22nd, the bus engine purred to life. The sound was different from any Sherman Eddie had ever heard. Deeper, more powerful. The whole tank seemed to vibrate with contained energy. Eddie climbed into the driver's seat for the first time, released the brake, and pressed the accelerator. The Sherman lunged forward like it had been stung, acceleration pressing him back into his seat. He hit 35 miles per hour in the motor pool. Yard, standard Shermans topped out around 25 on roads, less cross-country. Eddie had just created the fastest tank in the European theater. Now he just had to prove it was worth the court-martial. December 23rd, 06:00 hours. Eddie barely slept when the German attack came. Panzer Lehr Division elements, supported by several Panther tanks, hit their position in a dawn assault that caught the depleted American forces completely off guard. The motor pool erupted in chaos. Shells screamed overhead. Machine gun fire rattled off buildings. Katie heard the distinctive crack of high-velocity tank guns, the kind that meant Panthers, or worse. He ran to the tank park. Half the Shermans were already burning. Crews who had survived were falling back to secondary positions. The motor pool sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Kowalski, who had 3 Purple Hearts and 0 patience for heroics, grabbed Eddie by the shoulder. They needed every operational tank on the line immediately. Eddie pointed to his modified Sherman. Kowalski stared at him like he had suggested using a bicycle against panzers. That unauthorized piece of scrap. Eddie's voice was steady despite the fear coursing through him. It runs better than anything else here. And it was true. Every other Sherman in the motor pool was either destroyed, damaged, or already committed. Eddie's modification was the only tank available. Kowalski made a decision that probably saved his life and definitely saved the position. He grabbed 3 tankers whose Sherman had been knocked out, a gunner named Phillips, a loader named Rodriguez, and a commander named Lieutenant Jameson, who had a bandage around his head and blood on his uniform. He pointed them at Eddie's tank. Jameson looked at the non-standard engine configuration, visible through the open engine deck, and asked what the hell he was looking at. No time for explanations. Eddie took the driver's position. It was his tank. He knew every modification, every quirk, every capability. The crew piled in. They had perhaps 90 seconds of familiarization before Jameson was on the radio getting coordinates for German positions. Eddie had never been in combat as a tanker. He was a mechanic. He fixed things. He did not fight in them. But as he guided the Sherman out of the motor pool and toward the sound of guns, something changed. Every hour he had spent on this modification, every night without sleep, every risk of court-martial suddenly crystallized into purpose. The modified engine responded to his commands like it was reading his mind. They rounded a corner and encountered their first Panther. The German tank was 400 yards away, turret traversing toward them. Jameson shouted firing commands. Kay did not wait for the order to maneuver. He slammed the accelerator down and the Sherman leaped forward with acceleration. No Panther commander expected. The German gunner fired where they had been. The 75mm shell passed behind them. Eddie threw the tank into a slide, using terrain and speed in ways Sherman doctrine never imagined. They flanked right, using a destroyed building for cover, then accelerated again. The Panther was trying to rotate its turret to follow, but Eddie was inside its turning radius now, moving too fast. Jameson fired. The 75mm round caught the Panther's side armor at close range and penetrated. The German tank shuddered, smoke pouring from hatches. One down. Eddie's radio crackled with frantic calls. 2 more Panthers were advancing on infantry positions 800 yards north. Normal Shermans would take minutes to reach that position. Eddie covered the distance in less than 90 seconds, the modified engine screaming, tracks throwing frozen mud. They hit the Panthers from an unexpected angle. The German crews focused on the infantry ahead. Rodriguez loaded as fast as humanly possible. Jameson fired twice in quick succession. Both Panthers took hits. One brewed up immediately. The other's track shattered, immobilizing it. American infantry swarmed the crippled tank. The radio traffic changed tone. Other units were reporting it. A Sherman, moving at impossible speeds, hitting German armor from angles they couldn't predict. Someone asked for identification. Jameson, breathing hard, adrenaline making his voice tight, read the name painted on the turret. Detroit Speed Shop. By noon, every American unit in the sector knew about the lightning-fast Sherman that fought like no tank they had ever seen. The radio intercept reached Patton's headquarters at 1400 hours. Third Army Signals Intelligence was monitoring tactical frequencies when they caught multiple references to an American tank demonstrating performance characteristics inconsistent with known Sherman specifications. The G2 intelligence officer brought it to Patton's attention as a possible security concern. Were the Germans deploying a captured American tank with modifications? Was there a new variant that headquarters had not been informed about? Read the transcripts himself, his eyes narrowing at descriptions of speed and maneuverability. Then he saw the call sign. Detroit Speed Shop, Kowalski Special No. 1. Patton turned to his aide. He wanted that tank found. He wanted the crew assembled, and he wanted answers within the hour. By 1600 hours, Eddie and his crew were ordered to fall back to a rear assembly area. Lieutenant Jameson received direct orders from division. General Patton himself was inbound and wanted a demonstration. Eddie felt his stomach drop. Marshal he had been avoiding was about to be delivered by the most famously volatile general in the European theater. They waited beside the tank, the crew trying to clean themselves up, Eddie wondering if he should have just followed Captain Morrison's order and put the standard engine back in. Patton arrived in a convoy of jeeps, his Third Army staff trailing behind like nervous attendants. The general emerged from his jeep, ivory-handled revolvers visible at his waist, 3 stars gleaming on his helmet. His face was unreadable. He walked around the Sherman slowly, examining the modifications visible through the open engine deck. Kay asked who was responsible, came to attention, and identified himself. Corporal Edward Kowalski, motor pool mechanic, 3rd Armored Division. Patton stared at him for a long moment. Then he asked the question that would change everything. Show me what it can do. Eddie climbed into the driver's seat. Patton took the commander's position, displacing Lieutenant Jameson. The rest of the crew mounted up. Eddie started the engine, that deep rumble filling the compartment. Patton ordered him to proceed to the main road and then demonstrate maximum performance. Eddie complied. He took the Sherman through its paces, showing acceleration, top speed, maneuverability. He pushed the tank through terrain that would have bogged standard Shermans. He demonstrated the power-to-weight ratio that made tactical options possible that doctrine said were impossible. Patton's jeep convoy tried to keep pace and failed. The general's driver pushed his vehicle to maximum speed and watched the Sherman pull steadily ahead. After 15 minutes, Patton ordered a halt. He climbed out of the tank and stood in the road, looking at Eddie with an expression that was part calculation, part something that might have been respect. The general asked. Questions, rapid fire. Where did Eddie learn to do this? Why had nobody else thought of it? What were the performance specifications? How many could be produced? Eddie answered honestly. It was a bus mechanic from Detroit. He'd not thought of it as innovation, just problem solving. The engine came from a civilian bus. Could probably modify any Sherman that needed engine. Replacement anyway, using salvaged civilian or captured equipment. Patton turned to his staff officers. He wanted this mechanic promoted immediately. He wanted authorization for Eddie to modify every damaged Sherman awaiting repair. He wanted Ordnance Department engineers to study the modification, and he wanted it done yesterday. The captain who had threatened court-martial was also present, standing white-faced in the background. Patton looked at him and asked if there was any problem with these orders. The captain said, "No, sir, no problem at all." Eddie's court-martial disappeared like morning fog. In its place was a field promotion to sergeant, its command of a special projects team, and authorization to raid any salvage depot in 3rd Army's area of operations for parts. Patton shook Eddie's hand, told him he had just become the most important mechanic in Belgium, and returned to his jeep. As the convoy departed, Eddie stood beside his tank, trying to process what had just happened. He had gone from facing prison to having a general's direct patronage in the span of an hour. The transformation of Eddie's motor pool into Special Projects Detachment happened with the speed that only direct intervention from a 3-star general could accomplish. Within 24 hours, Eddie had a team of 8 mechanics hand-picked from across the division, a dedicated workshop space in a recaptured German maintenance facility, and priority access to salvage operations throughout the sector. The hunt for suitable engines began immediately. Eddie's team scoured abandoned bus depots, truck yards, and civilian industrial facilities across Belgium and eastern France. They found engines in the most unlikely places, a diesel generator at a textile mill, marine engines from riverboats, even a locomotive engine that Eddie considered before rejecting as too large. The challenge was not finding engines. Post-war Europe was littered with abandoned civilian machinery. The challenge was finding engines that met specific criteria. They needed to produce at least 350 horsepower, fit within the Sherman's engine, bay with modifications, and use fuel compatible with Army logistics. Eddie developed a checklist, a systematic evaluation process that let his team identify suitable candidates quickly. By January 10, 1945, 3 weeks after Patton's visit, they had completed 17 modified Shermans. Each one was slightly different, adapted to whatever engine Eddie's team had sourced, but all shared the fundamental improvement: more power, more speed, better survivability. Tank crews heard about the modifications through the rumor mill that operates faster than any official communication in any army. Requests started coming in. Commanders whose tanks had been damaged wanted to know if they qualified for the Kowalski treatment. Veteran crews specifically asked for assignment to modified tanks. The numbers backed up their preference. Data from the first month of combat operations told a story that even the most skeptical ordnance officers could not ignore. Standard Shermans in the same units, operating in the same conditions, had a 41% probability of being knocked out in their first engagement with German armor. The Kowalski Specials, as everyone now called them, had a 12% knockout rate. The modified tanks were not more heavily armored. They were not better armed. They were just faster, and that speed translated directly into survival. Crews could flank more effectively. They could withdraw from disadvantageous engagements before being destroyed. They could reach defensive positions faster, relocate between firing positions, exploit breakthrough opportunities that standard tanks could not capitalize on. Stars and Stripes sent a reporter in late January. The resulting article, "Detroit Mechanic Soups Up Shermans, Jerry Can't Keep Up," went semi-viral among frontline troops. Eddie's photograph appeared in the paper, grease-stained and grinning beside one of his creations. Letters from home mentioned it. His mother sent a clipping with a note saying the whole neighborhood was talking about it. But there were limitations. That frustrated Eddie. He could only modify tanks that were already damaged and awaiting engine replacement. The Army supply system, vast and inflexible, continued shipping new Shermans with standard engines from factories in the United States. Those tanks could not be modified without voiding contracts, violating specifications, and creating a logistics nightmare. Ordnance Department engineers visited, measured everything, took detailed notes, and explained that while Eddie's work was impressive, implementing it across the entire Sherman production line would take years and billions of dollars. Eddie understood, but still found it absurd. He could make these tanks better with salvaged parts and hand tools, but the enormous machinery of military procurement could not adapt. On February 3, 1945, Patton personally decorated Eddie at a formation that included most of the division. The general pinned sergeant's stripes on Eddie's uniform, an act that was technically redundant since Eddie already wore them, but Patton insisted on doing it personally. The general told the assembled troops that innovation could come from anywhere, that the Army needed soldiers who thought as well as fought, and that Sergeant Kowalski represented the kind of American ingenuity that would win the war. Eddie stood at attention, overwhelmed, thinking about the bus depot where this all started. March 22, 1945, the Rhine River crossing at Oppenheim. Operation Plunder was underway. Patton's Third Army forcing the last major water barrier between Allied forces and the heart of Germany. Eddie's unit received orders that made clear why all the modifications mattered. They were assigned to the exploitation force, the armored spearhead that would punch through German defenses once the infantry established a bridgehead. Speed was everything. The plan required tanks to advance faster than German forces could organize counterattacks, to seize bridges and road junctions before demolition teams could destroy them, to create chaos and dislocation in the German rear areas. Standard Shermans would struggle to maintain the pace required. 5 Kowalski specials were designated for the lead elements. Eddie commanded Tank No. 1, the original Detroit speed shop. His crew had been together since that first engagement in December. They knew the tank. They trusted each other. They crossed the Rhine on pontoon bridges under artillery fire, German shells throwing up geysers of water that rocked the floating spans. Once across, the orders were simple. Advance at maximum speed. Bypass resistance. Keep moving. Katie led the formation onto German soil, the modified engine pushing them forward at speeds that left supporting infantry far behind. The landscape blurred past. Small towns, forests, open farmland. German resistance was sporadic. Disorganized defenders more shocked by the speed of advance than prepared to stop it. They covered 40 miles in the first day, a pace that would have been impossible for standard armor. But on the second day, March 23rd, they encountered serious opposition. A German blocking force had established positions at a critical crossroads, anchored by a Tiger II heavy tank, the most formidable armored vehicle in the German arsenal. The Tiger II, called the King Tiger by Allied forces, mounted an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at extreme range. Its frontal armor was effectively immune to the Sherman's 75mm gun. Doctrine said you avoided King Tigers if at all possible, called in air support or artillery, definitely did not engage directly. Eddie did not have time for doctrine. The crossroads had to be taken within the hour or the entire exploitation plan would collapse. He studied the terrain through his periscope. The King Tiger was positioned to cover the main road, hull down behind an earthen berm that protected its lower hull. German infantry supported it from buildings on both flanks. A frontal assault would be suicide. Eddie formulated a plan that relied entirely on his tank's unique capabilities. He explained it quickly over the radio. The other 4 Kowalski specials would provide suppressing fire, forcing the King Tiger to button up and limiting the commander's visibility. Eddie would use speed and a concealed approach route through a drainage ditch to get behind the German position. It was risky. The King Tiger spotted him during the approach. One shot would end it. His crew acknowledged the plan without hesitation. Rodriguez checked ammunition. The gunner. Phillips had been replaced by a veteran named Kowalski. No relation. But Eddie found it amusing. Confirmed gun systems ready. Lieutenant Jameson, now Captain Jameson, after his own promotion, simply said, "Make it count." Eddie dropped into the drainage ditch, a concrete culvert barely wide enough for the Sherman's tracks. The modified engine's power was essential here, maintaining speed through terrain that would have stopped a standard tank. He could hear the King Tiger's gun firing, engaging the other Shermans. The entire tank shook with each impact transmitted through the ground. He emerged from the ditch 200 yards behind the German position, exactly where he needed to be. King Tiger's massive turret was oriented forward, its crew focused on the threat they could see. Eddie did not hesitate. He ordered fire. A tease. The 75mm gun barked. The round struck the King Tiger's rear armor, the thinnest point on the vehicle. Penetration. The German tank shuddered. A second round followed, then a third. The King Tiger's ammunition cooked off, the explosion blowing the 40-ton turret completely off the hull. News of the King Tiger kill reached Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force within hours. A Sherman, the tank that German crews joked about, had single-handedly destroyed the most powerful tank Germany produced. The intelligence value alone was significant. It demonstrated that American forces could defeat German heavy armor through tactics and innovation, not just superior numbers. But more importantly, it validated everything Eddie had been trying to prove since that December night in the bus. Depot speed was not just about getting places faster. It was about creating opportunities that did not exist for slower forces. It was about tactical flexibility, about presenting the enemy with problems they were not equipped to solve. General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, requested a briefing. On April 2, 1945, Eddie found himself at SHAEF headquarters in Reims, France, standing in front of a room full of officers whose combined rank could probably have invaded a small country. Eisenhower sat at the head of the table, flanked by staff officers, logistics specialists, and ordnance department engineers. Eddie, still wearing a uniform that smelled like gun oil and exhaust, tried not to think about how surreal this was. A bus mechanic from Detroit, explaining tank warfare to the man who commanded millions of soldiers. Eisenhower asked Eddie to explain the modification in detail, the engineering, the performance improvements, the tactical applications. Eddie did his best, using terms he thought they would understand, occasionally falling back on mechanics language when the technical details got complex. The engineers asked pointed questions about stress tolerances, mechanical reliability, parts commonality. He answered honestly. The modifications put additional strain on transmissions. Fuel consumption was higher. Some engines required more maintenance than the standard Continental radial. But the performance gains outweighed the costs, at least in his opinion. Eisenhower listened carefully, asking occasional questions that showed he understood both the technical and tactical implications. When Eddie finished, the Supreme Commander leaned back in his chair and made an observation that cut to the heart of everything. The Army had spent billions developing the Sherman. Thousands of engineers had worked on its design. Extensive testing had validated every component. Yet a mechanic with salvaged parts and hand tools had found an improvement that all those resources had missed. Why? The room fell silent. Nobody wanted to answer that question, especially not with the Ordnance Department representatives sitting right there. Eddie, perhaps because he had nothing to lose, or perhaps because months of frontline service had burned away any fear of speaking truth to authority, offered his perspective. The engineers designed for production, for reliability, for logistics, all valid concerns. But they were not getting shot at. They were not watching crews burn. They were optimizing for the wrong variables. The Sherman was a good tank for what it was designed to do. Eddie had just changed what it was designed to do. Eisenhower nodded slowly. He thanked Eddie for his service and innovation. Then he made it clear that while SHAEF appreciated the modifications, they could not officially endorse unauthorized changes to Army equipment. Too many potential liability issues, too many complications with supply chains and maintenance. However, the Supreme Commander continued, his expression carefully neutral. SHAEF would also not interfere with field expedient repairs and modifications undertaken by combat units to enhance operational effectiveness. If mechanics happened to install salvaged engines during the normal course of repairing battle-damaged vehicles, well, that fell under the discretion of local commanders. Eddie understood perfectly. Official approval was impossible. Unofficial tolerance was granted. Before leaving, Eddie made a request. He wanted to return to his unit. He could do more good in a workshop than a headquarters. Eisenhower granted it immediately, with an observation that the Army needed more people who understood where they were most effective. Eddie returned to his unit the next day. But the briefing had consequences. Other theaters started hearing about the modifications. Mechanics in Italy began experimenting with captured German engines. Tank units in the Pacific requested information about potential modifications using Japanese equipment. The idea was spreading. The concept that issued equipment was a starting point, not a limitation. April 1945. The war in Europe was clearly ending. German forces were collapsing on all fronts, the Reich shrinking daily as Allied armies closed in from east and west. Eddie's unit pushed deeper into Germany, encountering resistance that ranged from fanatical to non-existent, sometimes in the same day. The 17 Kowalski Specials had become legendary within Third Army. Crews competed for assignment to them. Maintenance personnel from other divisions visited Eddie's workshop to learn the techniques. Technical manual, unofficial, and hand-drawn, circulated among mechanics who wanted to attempt their own modifications. The final accounting of the Kowalski Specials combat record made for remarkable reading. 17 modified tanks operating over a 4-month period from late December 1944 through April 1945. 43 confirmed German tank kills, including Panthers, Tigers, and that one King Tiger. Countless other victories against self-propelled guns, tank destroyers, and fortified positions. Only 3 Kowalski Specials were lost in combat, a survival rate that was almost unheard of for Shermans operating in heavy combat. The statistical analysis that Army Ordnance conducted, reluctantly and only after direct orders from Eisenhower's staff, showed results that contradicted decades of procurement philosophy. The modified Shermans, built with salvaged parts and field modifications, demonstrated 340% better survivability than factory-standard tanks in comparable engagements. The performance improvement was not marginal. It was transformative. Eddie's personal tank, the original Detroit Speed Shop, survived the entire war intact. 7 confirmed kills were painted on the turret. 2 Panthers in that first engagement, near Bastogne. 3 more Panthers and a Panzer IV during the Rhine crossing operations. and the King Tiger that had become the most talked about kill in Third Army. On May 8, 1945. VE Day, Eddie and his crew celebrated in a captured German motor pool somewhere in Bavaria. The irony was not lost on him. He was surrounded by destroyed German tanks, the supposedly superior panzers that were going to win the war for Hitler. And every single one of them had been defeated by innovation, determination, and a willingness to ignore what everyone said was impossible. The question of recognition became a topic of debate among Eddie's superiors. Captain Jameson, who had been with Eddie since that first desperate engagement, argued strongly for recommending Eddie for the Medal of Honor. The kill record justified it. The innovation justified it. The impact on the entire armored force justified it. But Patton disagreed in his own particular way. The general argued that Eddie's contribution was bigger than any single act of combat heroism. He had changed how the Army thought about equipment, modification, and field innovation. That deserved recognition, but the Medal of Honor was specifically for valor in combat against an enemy. Eddie was not a combatant in the traditional sense. He was something else, something the existing award structure did not quite accommodate. The compromise was a Bronze Star, awarded for meritorious achievement in ground operations against an armed enemy. The citation praised Eddie's technical innovation, his courage under fire, and his significant contribution to the success of Third Army operations. It was unusual to award a Bronze Star for what was essentially engineering work, but Patton insisted and nobody was going to argue with him. Eddie accepted the medal at a formation in late May, the war over, everyone just waiting for orders to ship home. He stood at attention while Patton pinned the decoration to his uniform and said a few words about American ingenuity and the kind of soldiers who won wars. Afterward, Eddie returned to his workshop. There were still tanks to maintain, even if nobody was shooting at them anymore. He shipped home in July 1945, one of millions of soldiers transitioning back to civilian life. He carried with him a duffel bag of personal belongings, a Bronze Star in its presentation case, and detailed schematics of every modification he had developed. He did not know if any of it would matter in peacetime, but he kept the drawings anyway. The impact of Eddie Kowalski's modifications extended far beyond the battlefield. When the Army began developing next-generation tanks in the late 1940s, engineers studying combat reports specifically examined the performance characteristics of the modified Shermans. The M26, Pershing, and later the M46 Patton incorporated design philosophies that emphasized power-to-weight ratios and tactical mobility. Lessons learned directly from Eddie's field, expedient innovations. Eddie himself returned to Detroit, and his old job with the bus company for exactly 3 months before realizing he could not go back to routine maintenance. In 1946, he used his military separation pay to open Kowalski Custom Engine Works in a small garage on Detroit's east side. The shop specialized in performance modifications, building engines that exceeded manufacturer specifications. By 1950, he employed 17 mechanics and had a waiting list of customers. The Sherman he had commanded during the war, Detroit Speed Shop No. 1, survived the post-war scrapping that claimed most American armor. In 1989, the United States Army Tank Automotive Command held a ceremony honoring field innovations that had contributed to armored warfare development. Eddie, 69 years old, and still working in his shop most days, attended. They had restored his Sherman, painstakingly recreating the bus engine modification using the original schematics Eddie had donated to the Patton Museum. The tank sat on display, a testament to what one mechanic accomplished when he refused to accept that good enough was good enough. Eddie was asked to say a few words, kept it simple, the way mechanics do. He said he had just figured if a bus engine could haul 40 people up Detroit hills every day, It could push 30 tons of tank when it mattered. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come not from laboratories or billion-dollar programs, but from mechanics who simply refuse to accept limitations. Eddie passed away in 1994, leaving behind a legacy that proved ingenuity and determination could change the course of history.